searching, I feel there's something missing. I beg for some forgiveness, but begging's not my business. And she won't write a letter, although I always tell her. And so it's my assumption I'm really up the junction.
Hello comrades, and welcome back to another episode of SPECTRE, Season 4, Episode 3. And today's episode is a very special one indeed. Today we'll be examining the early life and work, political journey and legacy of one of Scotland's most renowned communist agitators, Willie Gallacher. Now for some of you tuning in, the name Gallacher might sound familiar, and rightly so. Gallachers served as a communist MP for West Fife from 1935 till 1950 and as a member of the Red Clydeside movement in the first part of the 20th century, where he played a very important part in the rise of socialism in Britain. Wherever the name John Maclean is mentioned, you can be sure Gallacher was right beside it in the history books. But for now, let's start right at the beginning, in Paisley, Renfrewshire to be exact. This is the birthplace of Gallacher, who was born to an Irish father and a Scottish mother. His father sadly died when Gallacher was only 7 years old, leaving the responsibility to bring in a wage to him, his mother and his sisters. Gallacher's story and early life is not one in isolation. His early childhood is one of those memories shared for many working class Scots. Gallacher began working from the age of 10 years old, leaving school at 12. Gallacher would find himself work as a steward on some transatlantic crossings before he began working at Albion Motor Works in Glasgow, 1912. Now one might think that all this work and experience would lead Gallacher to his first involvement in a movement, but they would be wrong. From witnessing what effect the blight of alcohol had on his family, the death of his father, older brother and later his mother, Gallacher found himself involved with the temperance movement in his mid-adolescence. However, on discovering that fellow colleagues had canvassed support for a director of a trust public house in the 1906 general election, Gallacher ended his association with the organised temperance movement. He did, however, remain a lifelong teetotaler up until his death, a feat considered remarkable by many a local Paisleyman. Other than being one of the few sober Scotsmen to walk the earth, he was famed among the ranks of men such as John Maclean, who he was brought into contact with during his time in the SDF, the Social Democratic Federation. The Paisley branch of the SDF introduced him to John Ross Campbell, who would later also become a prominent British communist and the editor of the Daily Worker, now known today as the Morning Star. Gallacher, like many a stalwart socialist, was opposed to Britain's involvement in the First World War. He played a vital role as chairman of the Clyde Workers' Committee, an organisation that was formed to organise Clydeside workers to campaign against the Munitions of War Act 1915. This act brought private companies supplying the armed forces under tight control of the newly created Ministry of Munitions under David Lloyd George. Workers were forbidden to leave their place of employment, and if they did, were subject to arrest and imprisonment. The Act also forbade strikes and lockouts. David Lloyd George and Arthur Henderson actually met Gallacher in the Clyde Workers' Committee in Glasgow, but they were unwilling to back down on the issue. Lloyd George and Henderson were furious following their meeting with the Clyde Workers' Committee, and in response enacted further repressions against the Clyde workers. Their journal, aptly called The Worker, was prosecuted with powers under the Defence of the Realm Act for an article criticising the war. Gallacher and the Workers' editor John Muir were arrested and both found guilty and sent to prison. Gallacher would spend 6 months and Muir 1 year at Calton Prison, described by Gallacher in his notes to be, quote, by far the worst prison in Scotland, cold, silent and repellent. Its discipline was extremely harsh and diet atrocious. The 1 hour's exercise in the morning was the sole opportunity we had of seeing each other when desperate attempts were made to exchange a whisper or two. End quote. Now, after the end of the First World War, Gallacher would see himself involved further in the struggle in improving workers' conditions in a fight for a 40-hour working week. Drawing close of the war, it became expected that the end of the war would be followed by widespread unemployment because of the re-entry of large numbers of demobilised soldiers and seamen into the workforce. Glasgow was expected to be badly affected because a large proportion of its workforce was employed in war-related such as munitions and shipbuilding, which would suddenly contract with the end of the war. Gallacher and the Clyde Workers' Committee proposed a campaign to limit working hours to 30 hours per week, which was altered to 40 hours per week after the Glasgow Trades Council became involved. In January 1919, the Clyde Workers' Committee and Trades Council launched a mass strike in support of the demand for a 40-hour working week. State forces, including British Army troops, broke up this mass rally of militant striking workers at George Square, Glasgow on the 31st of January 1919 to what we now refer to as the Battle of George Square. You see, following the wake of the Russian Revolution, the coalition government, like many others throughout Europe, were terrified of revolution spreading to the lands, and as such, they greatly overreacted to the strike by Glasgow workers, who they saw as Clydeside Bolsheviks. Gallacher perhaps aided in the opposition's fear after later stating that he would have marched to the barracks in Maryhill and encouraged the Scottish troops to leave them, just like the troops in Tsarist Russia did, and join the workers against the government. The leaders of the strike, union leaders and communists were arrested and charged with instigating and inciting large crowds of persons to form a part of a riotous mob. This included Gallacher, who would be sent back to Calton Prison for 5 months. Following the growing wave of revolutionary spirit seeping its way into Europe, Gallacher would become a leading figure in the Communist Labour Party. However, it was not at his time organising in the party that would see him reforged into the communist we know today. Gallacher would travel to Moscow, representing the Clyde Workers' Committee at the Second Congress of the Communist International, where he met Vladimir Lenin, who convinced attendees for the need of a communist party in Britain. Upon Gallacher's return, he was one of the early founding members of the newly formed Communist Party of Great Britain, known as the Communist Party of Britain today. Gallacher, for the rest of his life, would clearly recall this Congress and how it would shape him. In the 1939 publishing of We Have Met Lenin by Foreign Languages Publishing House, Gallacher recalls the following. In 1920, I got appointed by the comrades in Glasgow, associated with the Clyde Workers' Committee, to attend the Second Congress of the Communist International. We were at the time left, sectarian, and refused to participate in the discussions taking place between the BSP and SLP on the question of the formation of a Communist Party in Britain. We had the project in view of starting a pure Communist Party in Scotland, a party that would not, under any circumstances, touch either the Labour Party or parliamentary activity. As I hadn't a passport, and as there was a little likelihood of getting one, I set out for Newcastle, where after a week's effort I succeeded, with the assistance of a Norwegian comrade who was a fireman, in getting safely stowed away on a ship for Bergen, and from Wards to Murmansk, and from there to Leningrad. When I arrived at Leningrad, the Congress which had opened, there was in session in Moscow to where it had been transferred after the opening. In Smolny, I was made comfortable in a room, while some of the comrades tried to find an interpreter. While I was writing, one of them came in and handed me Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, which had just been printed in English. I started reading it quite casually, but when I came to the section dealing with Britain and saw what it had to say about me, I sat up in a jolt. I'd come away from Glasgow with the notion that our cause against the Labour Party and against participation in Parliament was so sound, so unassailable, that all I would have to do would be to put a few well-rehearsed arguments and the BSP and SLP would be wiped off the map. It was a real shock to find that already, before I had been anywhere near the Congress, all the fancy building I had been doing was knocked into complete ruin. But at the time, all the questions raised by Lenin were far from being clear to me, as was evident later in my speeches at the Congress. I got to Moscow on a Saturday at midday, was taken to a hotel just in time to be taken to a Subotnik. I got a job till 8 at night stacking pig iron in a foundry. On Sunday I was persuaded to play a football match and got myself kicked all over the field for an hour and a half. At night I met and had a very interesting talk with a young French comrade who had been lost, along with another companion and 3 fishermen between Murmansk and Vords. On Monday, with other delegates, I made my way to the Kremlin and to my first acquaintance with an international congress. In the main hall, groups of delegates were standing chatting and arguing. We passed through into the side room where delegates sat drinking tea, writing reports or preparing speeches. I was introduced to delegates from this and that country, and then I got into a group and someone said, "This is Comrade Lenin." Just like that, I held out my hand and I said, "Hello." I was stuck for anything else to say. He said, with a smile, as he was told that I was Comrade Gallacher from Glasgow, "We are very pleased to have you at our Congress." I said something about being glad to be there, and then went on talking about other things. I kept saying to myself, Christ, there's war everywhere. There are internal problems and external problems that would almost seem insurmountable. Yet here is a comrade supremely confident that the Bolsheviks can carry through to victory. Lenin joked and laughed with the comrades, and occasionally when I said something he would look at me in a quaint way. I later discovered this was in consequence of my English. He had difficulty in understanding it. I immediately felt that I was talking to not some faraway great man, hedged around him with an impassable barrier of airs, but to Lenin, the great party comrade who had a warm smile and a cheery word for every proletarian fighter. When I got going in the discussions in the political resolution and the trade union resolution, I got a very rough handling. Some of my best arguments were simply riddled. My opponents, when I got up to speak, never missed a chance of cutting in. Naturally, I would snap back at them, and things sometimes get very hot. As I felt the ground slipping away from beneath my feet, I get very bad-tempered. But Lenin, while carrying on criticism and principle of my line, would always take the opportunity of saying something helpful, something that took away a lot of the soreness from the difficult position my wrong ideas had rushed me into. In the political commission, the same thing was going on as in the open sessions. Every time I got up to speak, I would say things in such an offensive way that interruptions would start, and then 2 or 3 of us would be at it, hammer and tongs. On several occasions at these sittings, Lenin passed me short penciled notes, explaining a point or showing me where I was wrong. When the sitting would finish, I tear up my own notes and I tore up Lenin's along with them. It seems incredible now that I could do such a thing, but I never thought of it at the time. Towards the end of the political commission, when I had been very aggressive about the BSP and SLP, he passed me across a note which, in a very short, caustic way, gave an estimation of these groups. At night, I mentioned in confidence to 1 or 2 comrades that Lenin had given me a note about the BSP and SLP, which, if I had shown them, would have made them blink. "Where is it?" one of them asked. "Oh, I tore it up," I casually replied. "You what? You tore up a note in Lenin's handwriting?" He was aghast. "I tore up several," I said, "but they were personal, and I didn't think he'd want me to keep them." This fellow, who turned out later to be a thorough renegade, got me to promise if I got another note that I would give it to him. 2 days later, in the political commission, in the midst of a breeze and while I was speaking, someone made reference to infantile sickness. "Yes," I said, "I've read it, but I'm no infant. It's all right to treat me as one and slap me around when I'm not here, but when I'm here, you'll find I'm an old hand at the game." This later phrase caught Lenin's attention, and some time later, when Willie Paul visited Russia, Lenin repeated it to him with a quite credible Scotch accent. When I sat down after this effort, he passed me a note which read, "When I wrote my little book, I hadn't met you." I gave that note to the aforementioned renegade, to my present great regret. While insistent in carrying through this political line, Lenin gave both in the open sessions and in the political commission every conceivable assistance to myself and other comrades in order to help us to political clarity. "If you put the revolution first," he said, you won't find any difficulty. For the revolution, you will work with all sorts of people, for a part on the way at any rate. But if you start off by shutting yourself away from everyone, instead of getting in amongst them and fighting for the time of revolutionary advance, you won't get anywhere. Get into the party and fight for the line of the Communist International, and you'll have the strength of the Communist International behind you. In all our talks, the revolution was the living, throbbing theme of all that was said. I'd never had an experience like it. I couldn't think of Lenin personally. I couldn't think of anything but the revolution and the necessity of advancing the revolution, whatever the cost might be. This, ever since to me, seemed to be the outstanding duality of Lenin's great genius. He never thought of himself. He was a living embodiment of the revolutionary struggle, and he carried with him, wherever he went, the inspiration of his own great conviction. During the course of the Congress, I had another very close friend, Artem, who was killed in an accident the following year. Artem, or Sergeyev as he was more commonly known, used to talk a lot with me of the experience they had in the early days of the party. He was only about 19 or 20 when Lenin broke with the Mensheviks. He was absolutely devoted to Lenin and the party. In the course of one of our talks, he said to me, "We have another great leader, Comrade Stalin. Often when there is an exceptionally difficult problem before the political bureau, all eyes will turn to Stalin. In a few well-chosen sentences, he will give his solution, and it's always clear and decisive." That was the first time I'd ever heard the name of Stalin. When I returned to Glasgow and reported my impressions of the Congress, it was the first time any of the Glasgow comrades heard his name. It was not till I was over again in 1923 that I had the opportunity of meeting Stalin and learning at first hand how correct the estimations of Sergeyev was. It was arranged that John Reid and I should go to Baku, to the toilers of the East Congress there. Then a message came to the hotel. Lenin wanted to see me off. Off I went to the Kremlin. "When can you go home?" he asked me. "I'm going to Baku," I replied. He smiled and nodded his head in a negative way. "There's a big movement developing in Britain," he said. "Councils of action have been set up to stop the attack that is being made against us. You ought to get back as quickly as possible." "Do you agree?" I agreed, I answered. "When can you go then?" he asked. "Tomorrow if you like," I replied. He smiled broader than ever. "Why not tonight?" he said. "You could catch the train." "All right," I said. "Tonight, I've got nothing to pack." "Good," he said, standing up and holding out his hand. "Be very careful on the way back, and when you get to Britain, we'll look to you as a loyal fighter for the revolution and the Communist International." We shook hands very warmly, then I went on my way. That is the last memory I have of our great comrade Lenin. As mentioned, following his time in Moscow and with Lenin, the Communist Party of Great Britain would be formed, in which Gallacher would first run for election to the House of Commons at Dundee, both in 1922 and 1923, West Fife in 1929 and 1931, and Shipley in 1930. He would eventually find himself elected to represent the West Fife constituency at the close of the 1935 general election, winning with 13,462 votes, beating the Labour candidate William Adamson and Scottish Unionist candidate Charles Milne. But it wasn't just in his service as an MP that he would be remembered by. In 1925, Gallacher would be one of the 12 of the Communist Party of Great Britain members convicted at the Old Bailey under the Incitement to Mutiny Act of 1797, along with Tom Bell, Jack Murphy, Wal Harrington, Ernie Cant, Tom Winringham, Harry Pollitt, Albert Inkpen, Arthur McManus, William Rust, Robin Page Arnott and John Campbell. Their crime? Simply being members of the Communist Party of Great Britain. Then, in 1936, alongside all other committed communists and socialists, Gallacher stood in staunch support of the Spanish Republic. Gallacher organised his fellow comrades into raising money, medical supplies and food for the Spanish Republic and international brigades. This was back in a time when Labour MPs had a backbone too, with Stafford Cripps and Bevan relaying the Communist Party's call in favour of giving military assistance to the Spanish Popular Front government and fighting Franco and his thugs. Now, in a number of years, Gallacher would eventually lose his seat in West Fife to the Labour Party following the 1950 general election, coming third behind the National Liberal candidate. As the capitalist forces of the world reconsolidated themselves following the end of the Second World War, the formation of NATO and alliances made to defend capitalism against the inspiration that the USSR had delivered to workers around the globe would see an offensive approach made against communist parties and organisations in the First World. Communist candidates and anti-Cold War campaigners such as Gallachers were demonised. The British state could not afford the men and women of the Communist Party of Great Britain to be viewed as respectful or as pillars of their communities. Instead, a sharp anti-communist campaign was launched to demonise these brave communists as Russian agents. This sharp and elusive campaign can be attributed to the difficulty of communist MPs to be re-elected. Though success was found with communist councillors who are still remembered to this day, especially those of the Red Clydeside. Gallacher was a great communist, not just in his actions, but his political thinking as well. During his time he was the author of several books, including The Case for Communism, The Chosen Few, and The Tyrant's Might is Passing. He also wrote a book about his experiences during the First World War, The Revolt in the Clydeside, and The Last Memoirs of Willie Gallacher. A favourite and simple work of mine would be his article in Labour Monthly, published in 1953 for the passing of Comrade Stalin. In this article, he recalls his meeting with Stalin, his character, and the strength of the Soviet people. The following is the article in full. The people of the Soviet Union, the progressive forces and the peace movement throughout the world have suffered an irreparable loss through the death of our great and well-beloved comrade Joseph Stalin. In the first decade of this century, we read often in the columns of Justice and in our monthly magazines of the activities of the Russian Social Democrats, particularly so during the 1905 revolution and the London Congress in 1907. But although considerable interest was aroused by these events and by the intense participation of the Russian representatives in international congresses, it must be admitted that the names of the leaders of the Russian revolutionaries didn't register in our minds, not mine at any rate. It wasn't until 1917 that the name of Lenin shone out like a bright red star in the working class firmament. The great genius of Marxian strategy had by then fashioned the powerful working class weapon, a party of a new kind, that was to lay the bourgeois low. In 1920 I was in Moscow, attending the Second Congress of the Communist International. There I formed a warm friendship with comrade Sergeyev Artem, a miners' leader who had been abroad and who spoke good English. He was a member of the political bureau of the Bolshevik Party, and from this comrade I first heard the name of Stalin. He never tired of talking about this great comrade. Always, he told me, when some weighty problem was before them, all eyes turned to comrade Stalin. Stalin, he said, was the man beyond all others that Lenin and the political bureau depended upon. I didn't see Stalin during that visit. He was at the front with the Red Army. At Tsaritsyn, with comrade Voroshilov, he worked out the strategy that destroyed forever the hopes of the counter-revolutionaries and their imperialist backers. In doing so, he had to discard the plan prepared by Trotsky and the old generals, which would have led the Red soldiers into a swamp of kulikism, into a trap. Trotsky was brusquely pushed aside. Old generals were replaced by younger, thoroughly reliable comrades. From this, the legend was started that he was rude and ruthless, a judge of men and of situations. His great knowledge of Marxism-Leninism and his understanding of the class struggle enabled him to take the course that saved the revolution and routed its enemies. If he had been a petty bourgeois intellectual, he would have lost the revolution and earned the praise of the workers' enemies. But to save the revolution, that was rude, ruthless. In 1923, I met him for the first time. Lenin's illness had provided the enemies of the party with the opportunity of switching the party away from the path of Leninism, or so they thought. But they came up against the rock-like strength of Lenin's great disciple, Joseph Stalin. Let anyone who cares read the story of that period, the wild fulminations of the records in the party and in the press, the quiet crushing replies of Stalin that won for him increasingly the admiration and love of the party and the people of the Soviet Union. "We will build socialism in Russia," Lenin said. "It can't be done," said the Mensheviks. "You must wait till the capitalists develop heavy industry." "It can't be done," said the weavers. "You must wait till the workers in advanced capitalist countries take power." "It can and will be done," said Stalin, and through the years his wise guidance has led the Soviet people along the Lenin road to a happy, joyful life. In 1927, at the 10th anniversary of the revolution, I made a short speech to the Red Army in the Red Square. There had been rumours of a gang of traitors using the occasion to disrupt the demonstration and start street fighting. My speech was devoted to unity against the enemy, without and within. "These agents of the capitalist enemy who seek to disrupt our forces, turn them out of your midst," I exclaimed. When my speech was translated, Comrade Stalin reached across the others and shook me warmly by the hand. Then, a short time later, I was asked to go over to the Mokovaya to speak against one of the gang who had appeared at a hotel window and was shouting at the demonstration. But when I got there was no need for my services. The workers had dealt very effectively with the situation. A group of them rushed into the hotel, and had not several Red Army men been there, it would have fared ill with the egomaniac who attempted to disrupt the anniversary demonstration. When I got back to the Red Square and reported what had happened, I saw the lines crinkling round Stalin's eyes and the quiet smile on his lips as he listened to and nodded in appreciation of the translation. But I will never forget him as I saw him that day. He knew, as we all knew, that the enemies of the party, the enemies of the revolution, were going to make a desperate attempt to break up the 10th anniversary demonstration. But he stood there, calm and steady, with an abiding faith in the working class, a faith justified then, as it was so often after in the years that lay ahead. Calm and steady, yes, there on the Lenin Mausoleum in 1927, and there again in the much more exacting day 14 years later, with the Nazi hordes hammering at the gates of Moscow. See him there, strong and resolute, undaunted, inspiring his people to new courage and new great effort. "We'll drive the enemy out of our Soviet land and out of every occupied country in Europe." To the outside observers, it was impossible. But this, our comrade, with his knowledge of and faith in the people, could face and accomplish the impossible. The great patriotic war over, socialist reconstruction was taken in hand. What amazing progress has been made, what mighty undertakings have been carried through, and no capitalist country has the like ever seen. But then the road they travel is the Lenin road that leads to the new and happy life only communism can give. Along that road they were confronted with many problems. The transformation of the age-long peasantry economy to collective farming. Impossible, it can't be done, but it was done. Then, the first 5-year plan, designed to create heavy industry and make the Soviet Union independent of the imperialist countries. How the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois press sneered at this majestic conception. "The craziest scheme that was ever promulgated. It will break down before it is started." But it didn't break down. In 4 years, the great 5-year plan was completed, and the Soviet Union was well on the way to becoming the greatest industrial country in the world. From a ruined economy and a backward peasant country, they made that amazing journey in a few short years. Well, here in Britain, with statesmen like Baldwin, MacDonald, Attlee and Churchill, we travel in the opposite direction. From being the wealthiest country in the world, we are steadily drifting to ruin. A second 5-year plan, and then a third, and had it not been for the war and its fearful toll in life and the terrible devastation, the new society would now have neared completion. The final problems have been discussed, and under Stalin's guidance the answers have been found. Mourn as we do his passing, we take pride in the knowledge that 3 months before his death he published The Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. Here, as anyone can read, is the guide to the last stage on the road to the completed communist society, where, as the dream of the pioneers, each will give according to his ability, and each will get according to his need. So his life ended with his work completed, for the party and the Soviet people, still under the wise guidance, will go forward, resolute as he was resolute, to the new truly free society of Marx and Engels, of Lenin and of Stalin. Now Gallacher himself would remain active in politics and in the party, inspired by such great leaders as Stalin, as he served as chairman for the CPGB from 1950 until 1956. Then he became president, serving until 63 and 65. Now comrade William Gallacher would die on the 12th of August 1965 in his hometown of Paisley at the age of 83. Gallagher's funeral in Paisley was attended by thousands and thousands more lined the streets too. Figures such as Bob Stewart, Rajani Dutt, D.N. Pritt, Hugh McDermott, Frank Stanley, John Platts Mills and Johnny and Elsie Golan and many more. Among the pallbearers were Frank Stanley, Gordon MacLean and Peter Kerrigan. With a life so fully lived, what can we learn from William Gallacher's life and his political journey especially? Well, for one, his political growth is one to be admirably respected. He wasn't just a communist by name. He stayed true to one of the core principles of Marxism-Leninism, self-study. Gallacher was well read on the theoretical developments of Marxism, its implementation abroad, and how it could be translated and transformed to suit Britain and his fellow Scottish workers. Gallacher was not confined to a cage of dogmatism. This was seen even from his early years and his meeting with Lenin. Most modern Marxists would spit out their dummy and throw their toys out the pram if they were ever so critically analysed in such a manner, but not Gallacher and his comrades, who, like true communists, studied, just as Lenin before them, what needed to be done. Gallacher's ability to work and build a popular front in the fight against fascism is one we must greatly examine today, at a time when the right wing in Britain continue to rise as the economic conditions for workers worsens. As mentioned before, Gallacher was not confined to some MP's office. He remained vigilant and active, with his finger on the pulse of the working class communities across Britain, fighting for them in and out of office, showing to us all that the structures of bourgeois democracy will take you only so far. It is instead up to the full force of the workers to shatter the machine of capitalism and claim a better future. A future of socialism. A future of communism. Thanks again, comrades, for tuning in to another episode of Spectre. As always, be sure to share this with your friends, co-workers and comrades. And of course, be sure to leave us a like or review on whatever media platform you're tuning in from. Willie Gallacher will always remain as a spectre that shall haunt the British establishment. During his life, he gave rousing speeches that have echoed through time. So let's finish off with one of such speeches, his maiden speech after being elected as MP for West Fife. A speech that echoes through the streets of Scotland, England, Wales and the whole world today. On this side of the house we represent and speak for the workers of this country, the men who toil and sweat. So do we, shout those in Parliament. Oh, replies Gallacher, you do speak for the workers, do you? Yes, they shout again. All right, we shall see. The leader of the miners says that theirs is the hardest, most dangerous and poorest paid job in the country. Is there anybody who will deny it? The miner makes a demand, they ballot for it, and the ballot is a record. And we who speak for and on behalf of the miners demand an increase of 2 shillings a day for miners. We demanded it from the benches, now it's your turn. Speak now, speak, you who claim to represent the workers. We say not a penny for armaments. It is a crime against the people to spend another penny on armaments. Every penny we can get should go in wages for the miners, towards the health and well-being of the mothers and the children, and adequate pensions for the aged and infirm. 10 shillings a week. I would like the noble lady, Lady Astor, to receive only 10 shillings, and then she would change her tune. Last night the Chancellor was meeting some friends, and they were having a dinner, the cost of which was 35 shillings per head. 35 shillings per head for a dinner, and 10 shillings a week for an aged man or woman who has given real service to this country and has worked in a factory or mine. We require every penny we can get in order to make life better for the working class. If the £7 billion which we spent during the war in ruin and destruction had been spent in making life brighter and better for the people of this country, what a difference it would have made. I would have made an earnest appeal to those honourable members of the House who have not yet become case-hardened in iniquity. The national government are travelling the road of 1914, which will surely lead to another and more terrible war, and to the destruction of civilization. Are honourable members going to follow them down that road? The party which is represented on these benches, from which at the present moment I am an outcast, has set itself a task of an entirely different character, that of travelling along the road of peace and progress, and of spending all that can be spent in making life higher and better for all. We invite those of you who are prepared to put service to a great cause before blind leadership of miserable pygmies who are giving a pitiful exhibition by masquerading as giants, to put the first service to a great cause, not to a national government such as is presented before us, but to a Labour government drawing towards itself all the very best and most active progressive elements from all parties and constituting itself a real people's government concerned with the complete reconstruction of this country, with genuine cooperation with other peace nations for preserving world peace, and a government that follows the road of peace and progress. I make an appeal, even while I give a warning. Do not try to stop us on the road which we are travelling. Do not try to block the road by the meshes of legal entanglements or by fascist methods.
Special people change. How many lives are living strange? Where were you while we were getting high? Slowly walking down the hall, faster than a cannonball. Where were you while we were getting high? Someday you will find me caught beneath the landslide, in a champagne supernova in the sky. Someday you will find me caught beneath the landslide, in a champagne supernova, a champagne